And I will make room for you to do whatever you want to do. Wow. That caught me off guard. But that's really, I guess, what today's message is all about. Anyway, good grief. Muddling through the messy middle. That's my assignment. We're going to do a sermon series called Good Grief. And when I think of good grief, I think of Charlie Brown. You bet. I think Charlie would agree that this world is filled with pain and loss. Imagine Charlie Brown, hopes so often dashed, disappointments repeated. He'd go out to the baseball mound with his team, and the defeats just kept coming, There was those longings that always seemed out of reach. Scared to go and introduce himself to the little red-haired girl. Never could quite, get there. Kites always ending up in the trees. Diane has we do Charlie Brown calendars, Snoopy calendars every year, and she brought out one from last year where Charlie Brown has a new kite. And he's looking up at the tree and he says, "You're not going to get this one." Well, guess what? Yeah, the tree got that one. Friends that betray your trust. Lucy, the football. You keep hoping. And you think, maybe this time they won't betray me. And you find yourself flat on your back staring up at the sky yet again. I think Charlie Brown would agree that, there's pain and loss. He's no stranger to things to grieve, and as are all of us if we've lived very long on this earth. I was thinking about this in regard to young people at the back, and I thought, I'm sure you've already experienced your, grief and loss and pain. If you're a teenager, you live with that every day. And it's tough for me at 68, almost 69 years old to say, cheer up, it's only going to get worse. Because life is filled with this thing called pain. But let me say from 68 plus almost 69 years, that life is still good. Life is still good. And I've learned not I don't welcome pain ever. But I've learned that when it shows up, that I can embrace pain if I embrace someone else with it. And that's embrace my wife, embrace a friend, embrace another person. There's something about embracing pain with someone else that kind of makes it a little more bearable. But I found that the greatest person to embrace it with is Jesus. So anyway, Scotty reminded us last week that it's important for us as human beings to own our losses, our pain, our grief. Our emotional health depends on it. Our relational health depends on it. Our spiritual health depends on it. It seems like if we want to grow, we've got to grieve, 2 weeks ago, I was translating the book of Hebrews. Well, I've got a couple of students, and we're going through the book of Hebrews, but we were in chapter 5 2 weeks ago. We had that passage in chapter 5, verse 8, where it says that Jesus learned from the things that he suffered. That's even Jesus. And so it's part of life. You might recall, I think Scotty shared this last week. John Eldridge, in his book Wild at Heart, insists that a wound that goes unacknowledged and unwept is a wound that cannot heal. So simply bearing our wounds will never quite be adequate. Now, I don't know that every loss is the same kind of wound, but I am quite suspicious that we're a lot more wounded than we would admit. If anyway, we tend to bury it. But good grief is the process by which we deal with our loss, our pain, and grow beyond it. That's what we're working on here. Grief over a loss, that's kind of a given. When we have loss, we all grieve. The key is, do we grieve in a healthy way, or do we grieve in an unhealthy way? But we're going to grieve regardless. So we might as well figure out how to do it well. So it's a little more beneficial. Anyway, this sermon series is about how we get started, and we want to promise that when we get done with the sermon series, if beyond what we've talked about, if there's some things you say, I need to go a little further, we're going to have a grief group, a grief share group, and that's coming up, not too terribly far down the road, where if you want to do some serious grief work, we're going to work on that together. So be aware. But anyway, good grief has three parts. The first, we own our losses. We face our pain. It's where we start. That's Scotty's sermon last week. Second, we wait in the messy middle. That's the tough part. That's my message today. And then finally, we allow God to birth something new. And I want to add the words, and wonderful, from the ashes of our loss. That's next week. Scotty will be back to work with us next week. And then the week after that, Scotty's friend, what's his name again? Jonathan. Yeah. Jonathan's going to be here to share a story of God's work through pain and loss. And that will be helpful when we get there. But today, what does it look like to wait in the messy middle? Well, it's complicated. And if I were to offer you some kind of simple answer, you would need to slap me, or maybe better still, shoot me. Deal with each of our grief. Grief deserves something more than just a flippant answer, an easy answer. It deserves something a little more somber, a little more serious. I think that there is simplicity to come to in grief eventually. But I think we have to go through a lot of complexity before we get there. It can become simple out there somewhere. But in the messy middle, it gets really, really complicated. And so, anyway, we want to talk about that. One of the things that I think we long for in our grief is some sense of explanation. It's the painful part. The elephant in the room question seems to be, why? Why did this happen? Why did this happen to me? What have I done? What have I failed to do for this to happen to me? And then, along the way we might get it happened because, and then it's like the stick poking us in the brain. It said, yeah, but why did that happen? And we just deal with that that why question. You know, Job longed for an answer to the why. If you go back and look at Job, Scotty talked about Job last week, but basically Job is experiencing the suffering, and it's like, I just want my day in court with God. I just wish I'd be able to somewhere and let someone tell me what's going on here so I could defend myself. And he is begging for an answer to the why question. And then his friends show up, and they're sitting with him in silence for 7 days because they're overwhelmed by his grief and sorrow. And that was a good thing. And as long as they kept their mouths shut, they were a comfort to Job. But when they started talking, they started trying to explain Job's pain to Job. And his comforters at that point become Job's tormentors when they try to offer an explanation for which, sometimes there's just not any explanation at the time. The why question, it's the big question, but I had to give up the why question a long time ago. It just wasn't very helpful. May 1982. Finishing up seminary in California, and Diane and I are there. Okay, she did the major work, but I was there with her, okay. But Michael Ann Fowler, born with a diaphragmatic hernia. Her stomach had formed where her left lung was supposed to. It had pushed her heart over. She had no left lung. Her right lung was smaller than it needed to be. We got to hold her ever so briefly, and then they whisked her away, did surgery on her to correct all of those things. But she just didn't have enough lung tissue to support her body. And 33 hours later, she was gone. We went home to a cradle that I had crafted with my own hands, bumper pads and mattress cover that Diane had made with her own hands. There was a big wood rocker there that a family in the church had purchased for us, so that we could rock her in the cradle and rock her in that chair. And we went home to stare at an empty cradle and an empty rocker. June 1983, just over a year later, we're back in Saskatchewan. And we're expecting a baby girl, Katie. We love our Katies. And we had prayed about, what do we name this child? And we just sensed God saying, Catherine Joy. Catherine meaning pure joy. Little Katie. Everything had been normal. Diane went in for a regular checkup the day before her due date. And they found no heartbeat. I was, in a day before cell phones, I was blocks away, and they were able to contact me, and we go to the hospital, and we're there that night, knowing that the next day they're going to induce labor on her due date. We're going to go through that whole process again and go home to that empty cradle and empty rocker. And I remember I looked at Diane, I said, what are we going to name this baby? Catherine Joy, really? God, please don't ask me to do that. We struggled with that. We felt like, no, that's what we need to do. Anyway, next day, she's born, and she's beautiful. What had happened, she had made a loop in a cord and crawled through the loop, and when she had dropped down into the birth canal to be born, the knot had tightened, and it cut her circulation off. So she was born, stillborn. Michael Ann and Katie are buried head to foot in the cemetery in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, in the Babyland part of the cemetery. Head to foot because, you know, when you buy that first plot, you never stop and think about buying the one next to it. You just don't imagine that. There were a lot of people who wanted to offer answers to the question why. And you know, it's like, if you need one, okay, fine. But just don't share it with me, because I haven't heard anything yet that satisfies. You know, God just needed another little angel in heaven. Oh, really? Millions of babies aborted every year. God just needed another little angel in heaven. No thanks. That wasn't helpful. One lady, well, God's breaking your heart now, so he didn't have to break your heart more later. I wanted to break her nose. Oh, man. Remember one guy comes up and, you know, he wants to spend time with me. We go out for coffee, and we have the you know, the chit chat, and then you know what he's there for, and he starts into it. And I said, wait, are you trying to explain this to me? He says, well, yeah, I guess. And I said, listen, if you need an answer, and you have an answer that satisfies you, that's great. You go for that. But please don't share it with me. Just keep it to yourself. Why question? Just not very helpful, you know. But there were some questions that were helpful. Really, really helpful. First, there was the who question. God, who are you? And who do you want to be to me today? God, you're the great I am. But I need to know who you want to be to me today, to us. Right now, in this time of our life, God, I need you. I need you desperately. You know, back to the guy that had tried to explain it. No, not him. It was another guy. He asked me, he said, are you angry? Angry? You mean like at God? You know, I need him so desperately. He's my only chance of surviving this. I just don't see where it would be that helpful for me to be angry with God. But angry, yeah, I guess I'm angry. I'm angry at those Christians who make the Christian life out to be following God's standards, keeping the rules, being obedient. Obedience is a beautiful word. We can talk about it another time, but you know, where it's like that, meeting the mark, measuring up the do's, the don'ts. I said, you know, people who live with that kind of Christianity, something like this happens in their life, and they have no idea what to do because they've kept the rules, but this still happens. And they have no idea what to do. But people for whom Christianity is a relationship with Jesus, it's knowing him and drawing life from him. Something like this happens. You already know kind of what to do. You have no clue. On the one hand, you have no clue. But on the other hand, you know, I need to just send my roots down deeper into him. I need to draw life from him. God, who are you? And what do you want to be to me? The Apostle Paul once said, Philippians, he said, that I may know him. And you say, Paul, I thought you already knew Jesus. Well, yeah, but I really want to know him. He says that I may know him in the power of his resurrection. And everybody, oh, yeah, me too. I want to know Jesus in the power of his resurrection. Yeah, love that stuff. And then Paul says, and in the fellowship of his suffering. Everybody's hand goes down. We're not so eager to know him in the fellowship of his suffering, but in my experience, and that's all I know to say, in my experience, I've come to know him best, more intimately, more personally, in the fellowship of his suffering than I've ever come to know of him in the power of his resurrection. And that's just me, okay? But it's God, I need to know who you are. Remember Job? God answered none of Job's why questions. Not a one. But he did reveal himself. And basically what he revealed of himself was, Job, I am too big for you to understand. That was pretty much it. And you know how Job responds to it? He says, God, I have heard of you with the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. God, everything that I knew of you up to this point in my life, it's really just been hearsay. It's what people told me about you. But God, because of what I've been through, I think I know you now more than I've ever known you before. I think I really see who you are. And I have no clue. But I think I see enough of you and your glory and your grandeur. And there was a measure of peace in that for Job. It's the who are you question. Then there's the how question. God, how do we go forward? Diane and I. We long for children, but we're scared to death to try again. God, how do we wait on you? What does that look like? God, I don't know. And then the biggie with the how question was, God, how do we trust you? What to? I know that's the door out of this experience of pain. I know somehow that's the answer. But God, I'm not quite sure how to do that right now. I'm feeling a little shaky. And then there was eventually the what question. God, what are you trying to teach me about you, about me, about life? But even more than that, what are you trying to teach me? God, what are you seeking to shape in me? To be a follower of Jesus is to say, I want to be like Jesus. Do we make room for him to do whatever he wants to? Thank you for that song. How do we make room in the rough and tumble of life when we're dealing with pain and loss? How do we make room for God? God, do what you want to do with this. God, there's so many things in life that I don't think God sent those things on us. But he allowed them to come because he had a purpose for them. If we want to live pain-free, I'm not quite sure how to do that. But if we want to live purposefully, then that's what God's up to. So there were some of these questions that we found helpful. I found helpful. But I want to admit that somewhere along the way, we need to be ready to deal with God's silence as well. Not every question gets a quick answer. And some questions, like Job's question, never get answered. And I've also observed that God at times seems indifferent to our questions. Sometimes his answer is silence. I saw him work with my daddy. My daddy, always a very righteous man, wanting to do what God wanted him to do. Daddy was also a man who paid close attention to the way life worked and avoided a lot of situations that most of us just go running into it to our hurt. Daddy's philosophy was, most of the pain in life that we experience as human beings, we could avoid if we just pay attention. And when we hurt, it's probably good for us because we've been stupid. Anyway, Daddy was not the most compassionate person when it came to pain. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And then I watch Daddy, and I forget all the circumstances, but he went through a long period of excruciating pain in his right eye. Some blood vessels in his eye had burst, and the drainage system got clogged up. And what normally is 8 to 10, I don't know if it's pounds per square inch or kilopascals or what it is, but pressure in the eye is supposed to be something like 8 to 10, whatever that measure is. And Daddy's was like 25 and 30 and 40. And within just a few weeks, 4, 5, 6 weeks, he lost sight in that eye. It went up where sometimes it was as high as 60, 70. And your eye is one big nerve, okay? And just excruciating pain. 6 months of this. Daddy could talk to God about anything else in his life and feel like God listened and God responded and God would give leadership and direction, but Daddy would talk to God about his eye, and it seemed like heaven was just silent. Like God didn't even notice that Daddy had a problem with his eye. Eventually, they thought they were going to have to take it out, but did some laser surgery and other things, and Daddy was able to keep his eye. Never restored his sight. He was blind in that eye from then on, but he got to keep it at least. It was fun to watch him, pull into the driveway for the garage. He'd roll the window down and he'd line that good eye up. Depth perception, lost it all. But one day my sister and I were visiting with Daddy. He was telling us what he was up to. And I remember Judy burst out and said, "Daddy, you're compassionate." Somehow, in that experience of pain, God was doing something in Daddy. And it changed something in him to where if you're hurting, doesn't matter if it's your own fault or not. Doesn't matter if you're stupid or if it wasn't, you have anything to do with it at all. If you're hurting, you're hurting. And my daddy would show up. If you were from Bloomington, Texas, and in any of the hospitals in Victoria, Texas, you got one visit at least from my daddy. And if you didn't ask him not to come back, he'd be back again. Because his heart would respond to hurting people. It was just beautiful to watch that in my life. But that's kind of next week's sermon, okay? What God births out of the ashes of our pain and suffering. Let's come back to today. But I'm thinking about this thing of silence. Brennan Manning, in his book, Ruthless Trust, has this to say. He says, "The scandal of God's silence in the most heartbreaking hours of our journey And let me just stop there and just say, yeah, that happens. Then he goes on to say, is perceived, and I would say, not immediately. Not immediately perceived, but eventually perceived, in retrospect, as a veiled, tender presence and a passage into pure trust that is not at the mercy of the response that it receives. Ultimately, what do we do while we're waiting in the messy middle of grief? I think it's this. I think we learned to trust our lives to a loving Father. One of my favorite Old Testament scriptures is Isaiah 50, verse 10. Who among you fears the Lord and obeys the voice of his servant? That sounds like a fairly good resume, right? Yeah. You know, I honor God. I try to do what God wants me to do. I'm trying to live my life the way he wants me to. And I put the and yet here because some translations catch the sense of the and yet, some don't. But and yet walks in the dark and has no light. You know, I love Jesus. I'm trying to do what he wants me to do. And yet, here I find myself in this spot. Jesus said, I'm the light of the world. Whoever loves me will not walk in darkness. And then, doggone it, some days we do. Who among you fears the Lord and obeys the voice of his servant and yet walks in the dark and has no light? Let him trust in the name of the Lord and rely on his God. Let him trust in the name of the Lord. The name of the Lord, who you've come to understand God to be. Who God has revealed himself to be in the person of Jesus. That God. Trust him. Lean into that. In the messy middle, we learn to trust, or need to, if we're going to survive it. Pardon me. Brenner Manning says it like this. He says, the way of trust is movement into obscurity, into the undefined, into ambiguity, not into some predetermined, clearly delineated path for the future. No, it's not like that at all. He says, against insurmountable obstacles and without a clue to the outcome, the trusting heart says, and let me say this, this is the hard part. And this is the part I struggle with. This is that song that we sang, help me make room, God, for you to do whatever you want. He says, Abba, I surrender my will and my life to you without any reservation. Oh my goodness, that part's hard. Without, I've got all kinds of reservations. And with boundless, mine is the slenderest of confidence. I can't call it boundless, but it's confidence that you are my loving Father. For me, I'm not that without reservation, not that boundless confidence, but I understand that somewhere in that it's a choice that we make. Job would remind us, confirm that it's a conscious decision that we make and then we struggle to maintain. In Job 13:15, he says, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. That's not a, whew. You don't just run home and practice that prayer, do you? No. But Brennan Manning says this. He says, the greatest gift that we can give God is our trust. Anyone ever see Will Smith, Pursuit of Happiness? Remember that one? Single parent with a young child, preschooler, ends up homeless, spends one night in a subway restroom barricading it against people who are trying to get in, banging on the door. This little boy just huddled against his father in this terribly strange place. The next night they're able to get into a homeless shelter by the skin of their teeth. And Will Smith is, he's just trying to hold all of this together. His little boy is sitting there, going through this trauma. And Will asks him, first he says, he tells his son, he says, I love you. And his son, I love you. And Will says, can you just trust me? Can you just trust me? And his son says to him, Daddy, I trust you. And I think of that. I watch that scene and I think of how God has really taken so much better care of me. And he asks us in those hard times, he says, can you trust me? Will you trust me? I love you. Can you trust me? Brennan Manning says that the greatest gift that we can give God is the gift of trust. Oh, man. Trust is what we give back to God. Brennan Manning says that he finds it so enchanting, our trust, that Jesus died for love of it. That just amazes me. Let me give you a word about Brennan Manning and ruthless trust. Probably no author I've ever read paints so pure a picture of the love of God as this man, Brennan. Brennan, no longer with us, died a few years ago. But book after book, Ragamuffin Gospel, The Relentless Love of Jesus, Abba's Child, they reveal God's love in just ways that are so vivid. And I appreciate his voice about God's love in my life so much. But then there's that book, Ruthless Trust. And it takes a really wild twist because basically ruthless trust is about what do you do when everything that you've come to know about God's love, when that gets contradicted by the circumstances that you were in. Wow. Brennan says, you trust, and you trust ruthlessly. Ruthless. What does ruthless mean? Well, ruthless is without pity. And Brennan says that ruthless trust is without self-pity. According to Brennan, self-pity is the arch enemy of trust. But doggone it, self-pity is an inevitable part of grieving. That's just it, So what do I do? Self-pity is the arch enemy of trust, and yet it's inevitable. There comes that point when self-pity becomes malignant, and it starts multiplying itself and sucking whatever remaining life we have left in us. And according to Brennan, we simply ask God for grace to set a time limit on that self-pity. There's been times in my life I stewed in pity overnight. And I think of other times in my life where it was more like 2 weeks. And I would go to God in my prayer, and I would have my little whimper and my little snivel. And God listened to it patiently. And after about 2 weeks, one time, he said, Fowler, it's time for you to quit your sniveling and trust me. There have been times where that was something more like 2 years. Something not that far ago. Something we suffered in 19 that just last fall, I think I finally quit pitying myself after almost 2.5 years, and have found some peace, amazingly. Then I remember something maybe a little longer ago that had eaten at me for 15 years. And finally found the way out of self-pity in trusting him. If we want to move out of self-pity and into a healthier way of dealing with our grief, it's going to come when we decide to trust. And I'm not saying it's easy. You know, my history is not good. It's good in some ways, and it's lousy in others. But I want to suggest to you, if we're not actively trusting God for something in our life, then maybe we're not living the Christian life. If the just shall live by faith, then what are we trusting him for today? Got to be something, right? For life to be lived by faith. Oh my goodness, I'm always too late. But Romans 8:18. These are verses I've found helpful for me to trust. For I consider the sufferings of this present time not worthy to be compared with the glory that's to be revealed in us. Paul said that. I need to remember that God has something special planned for us, and that pain's not the last word on God's work. Then there's Romans 8:28. We know that God works all things together for good, for those that love him who are called according to his purpose. He's not saying that all things are good. He's just saying that he's going to work all things together for good. And then 2 Corinthians 4:17 and 18. This one gets a little aggravating to me. Paul says this momentary light affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond comparison. And I think, momentary, Paul, are you crazy? Light. This is not light, Paul. Affliction. Okay, 1 out of 3 you got right. But it says momentary. Wait. Pardon me. Eternal. This momentary as opposed to an eternal. This light as opposed to a weight. This affliction as opposed to glory. He says, God's working this out. He says, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient. They are time-bound. The things that are so difficult, those are time-bound things. But the things that aren't seen, they're eternal. They last forever. I want to close this morning. Good grief, Charlie Brown. What is good grief? Good grief pays attention to the pain. Good grief waits on God and learns to trust in the messy middle. And then good grief allows God to birth something new. And again, I would add, and wonderful, out of the old. That's where we're headed. Let's go on this journey together. Father, help us to trust you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you. God bless you.